The evening air was crisp as luxury cars pulled up one after another in front of the Steinhardt Concert Hall. Women in silk gowns and men in tailored suits stepped out, their jewelry catching the light from the grand entrance. This wasn't just any concert. Tonight, the world-famous pianist Viktor Petrov would perform, and tickets had sold out within hours. Inside the concert hall, everything sparkled. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. The red velvet seats were arranged in perfect rows, each one costing more than what some families earned in a month. Ushers in crisp uniforms guided guests to their seats, their movements smooth and practiced. Backstage, Victor stood in front of a full-length mirror, adjusting his bow tie. He was a tall man in his late 40s with silver hair swept back perfectly. His fingers, long and elegant, moved with the kind of grace that came from decades of practice. He had performed in every major concert hall across Europe, Asia, and America. Critics called him a genius. Magazines featured him on their covers. Yet somewhere along the way, success had changed him. His assistant, a nervous young woman named Lisa, knocked softly before entering. "Mr. Petrov, we're 30 minutes from curtain. The hall is completely full. Even the standing room is packed." Victor barely glanced at her. "Of course it is. They always come." He examined his reflection once more, turning slightly to check his profile. "Has the mayor arrived yet?" "Yes, sir. Front row, left side, along with several members of the city council and—" Lisa hesitated, checking her tablet. "And there's a small situation at the entrance." Victor's eyes narrowed. "What kind of situation?" "I don't want any disruptions tonight. It's just a boy, sir. Security stopped him because he doesn't have a ticket. He's insisting that he needs to see the performance." "He has a violin case with him?" Victor scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "A boy with a violin? Let me guess, he thinks he's a musician." He laughed, but there was no warmth in it. These people always think that owning an instrument makes them artists. "Tell security to send him away. This is a serious venue, not some open mic night at a coffee shop." Lisa nodded and left quickly, uncomfortable with the coldness in his voice. Victor returned his attention to the mirror, but his mood had soured slightly. The problem with fame, he thought, was that everyone believed they deserved a piece of it. Everyone thought they had talent. But true artistry was rare. It required breeding, education, and years of expensive training. It wasn't something you could just pick up from the streets. Out in the lobby, the situation was escalating. The boy stood near the entrance, his clothes worn and clearly too small for him. His jacket had patches on the elbows, and his shoes were scuffed beyond repair. He couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 years old. His dark hair was messy, as if he'd been traveling for a long time without rest. "Please," the boy said to the security guard, his voice steady, despite the tears forming in his eyes. "I came so far. 3 days on the bus. I saved money for 6 months just for the ticket, but someone stole my bag at the station. I have nothing left, but I need to hear him play, just this once." The security guard, a large man with a stern face, shook his head. "Kid, I'm sorry, but no ticket means no entry. Those are the rules. This isn't a charity event." People walking past glanced at the scene. Some looked sympathetic, but most simply walked by, not wanting to be involved. In a world of designer clothes and expensive perfumes, the boy's presence felt out of place, almost offensive to some. The venue manager, Mr. Chen, happened to walk through the lobby at that moment. He was an older gentleman who had worked in the arts his entire life. He saw the commotion and approached. "What's going on here?" The security guard explained the situation. The boy looked up at Mr. Chen with hopeful eyes. "Sir, I just want to sit somewhere anywhere." "I don't need a good seat. I can stand in the back. I won't make any noise, please." Mr. Chen studied the boy's face. There was something genuine in his desperation. Something that reminded him of why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Against his better judgment, and knowing Victor would likely be angry, he made a decision. "Put him in the last row, far left corner," Mr. Chen said to the usher nearby. "The seat that's been reserved for staff if needed." The security guard looked surprised. "Sir, are you sure?" Mr. Petrov specifically said. "I'll handle Mr. Petrov," Mr. Chen interrupted. The boy traveled 3 days. That's more dedication than half the people in this building have ever shown for anything. The boy's face lit up with such pure joy that even the stern security guard couldn't help but smile a little. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. You won't regret this, I promise." As an usher led the boy toward the back of the auditorium, Mr. Chen pulled out his phone. He knew he had to inform Victor, even though he wasn't looking forward to the conversation. He dialed the backstage line. Victor answered immediately. Yes? Mr. Petrov, this is Chen. I wanted to inform you that we've seated a young patron in the back row. He had some difficulties with his ticket, but I felt it was appropriate to accommodate him. There was a long pause. When Victor spoke, his voice was ice cold. The boy with the violin? Yes, sir. You put him in my concert hall? Are you trying to embarrass me, Chen? What will people think when they see some street kid sitting among our distinguished guests? He's in the very back, sir. No one will even notice him. And it's just for tonight. I noticed, Chen. I noticed the standards of this establishment dropping. But fine, he's already in. Just make sure he doesn't approach me afterward. I don't have time for amateur hour. The line went dead. Mr. Chen sighed, pocketing his phone. He hoped he'd made the right choice. Inside the grand auditorium, the boy sat in his seat, overwhelmed by the beauty around him. He'd never seen anything like this before. The ceiling was painted with scenes from classical mythology. The stage was massive, with a beautiful grand piano sitting center stage under a spotlight. The instrument gleamed black and perfect, like something from a dream. The boy clutched his violin case tightly on his lap. His heart was racing with excitement and nervousness. He'd listened to Victor Petrov's recordings 1,000 times on a broken radio at home. Each note had been an escape from his difficult life, a window into a world of beauty and order. And now he would finally hear that music live. As the lights began to dim, the conversations throughout the hall faded to whispers, then to silence. The boy leaned forward in his seat, his eyes fixed on the stage. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences this night might bring, he knew this moment would change his life forever. The curtain began to rise, and the audience held its breath in anticipation. Backstage, Victor paced back and forth in his dressing room, his mood completely ruined. He couldn't stop thinking about what Chen had told him. A poor boy, sitting in his concert hall. It felt like an insult, a degradation of everything he'd worked to build. Lisa knocked again, this time more hesitantly. Mr. Petrov, 5 minutes to curtain. I know, he snapped. He caught his reflection in the mirror again and forced himself to take a breath. He was a professional. He wouldn't let some nobody ruin his performance. Still, the irritation bubbled beneath his calm exterior. Tell me about this boy, Victor said suddenly. What did he look like? Lisa seemed surprised by the question. Young. Maybe 12 or 13. He was wearing old clothes. Looked like he'd been traveling. He was very polite, though, very respectful. He said he'd been saving money for 6 months just to buy a ticket. Saving money? Victor laughed bitterly. If he had to save that long, perhaps he should have spent it on something practical. Food, clothes. Not wasting it on something he couldn't possibly understand. Sir, I think he genuinely loves music. He was carrying a violin. Everyone thinks they love music, Lisa. But there's a difference between loving something and understanding it at its highest level. That requires education, training, access to the best teachers. It requires a certain background. Victor straightened his jacket one final time. That boy sitting out there, no matter how much he thinks he appreciates what I do, he's operating on a completely different level. It's like someone who's only eaten fast food claiming to understand fine dining. Lisa didn't respond. She'd worked for Victor for 2 years and had grown used to his attitude, but sometimes it still bothered her. She remembered reading an interview, once where Victor talked about growing up poor in a small village, how a local teacher had recognized his talent and helped him get into music school. She wondered if he remembered that part of his story anymore. 2 minutes, sir, she said quietly. Victor nodded and walked toward the stage entrance. As he moved through the backstage corridor, he could hear the murmur of the audience settling into their seats. This was his favorite moment right before the performance, when everything was potential and possibility. He lived for this feeling. But tonight, it was tainted. He kept picturing that boy in the back row, probably sitting there in his cheap clothes, surrounded by people who actually belonged. Victor had worked too hard to get where he was. He'd sacrificed everything. He'd practiced until his fingers bled, studied until his eyes burned, performed when he was sick and exhausted. And he'd done it all to reach the pinnacle of his profession, to play for the elite, the educated, the refined, He didn't need reminders of where he'd come from. He didn't need some poor kid sitting in his audience making him feel guilty for his success. The stage manager gave him the signal. The lights in the auditorium dimmed completely. A hush fell over the crowd. Victor stepped out onto the stage and the audience erupted in applause. The boy in the back row clapped so hard his hands hurt. He'd never seen anything like this in real life. Viktor Petrov looked even more impressive in person than in the photographs. The way he carried himself, the confidence in every step, it was like watching royalty. Victor bowed slightly to the audience, then took his seat at the piano. He adjusted the bench, flexed his fingers, and let the silence stretch out. This was part of the performance too, building the anticipation until it was almost unbearable. Then he began to play. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the concert hall. The sound was incredible, powerful and delicate at the same time. Victor's fingers moved across the keys with impossible speed and precision. Every note was perfect, technically flawless. The boy leaned forward, completely absorbed. This was what he'd traveled 3 days to hear. This was why he'd saved every spare coin for half a year. The music washed over him like a wave, and for a few precious moments, all his troubles disappeared. He wasn't poor. He wasn't alone. He wasn't hungry or tired. He was just part of this beautiful sound. But something felt different than he'd expected. On the recordings, Victor's playing had seemed to carry emotion, a depth that made the boy's heart ache. But here, live. It felt different. The notes were all correct, the timing perfect, but something was missing. It was like looking at a beautiful painting behind glass, something you could admire, but never quite touch. The boy shook his head slightly. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe he was too inexperienced to understand what he was hearing. These wealthy people around him seemed entranced, nodding appreciatively at certain passages. Who was he to judge? The first half of the concert lasted 45 minutes. When Victor finished, the applause was thunderous. People stood up, clapping enthusiastically. Victor bowed multiple times, a small smile on his face. This was what he deserved. This was recognition from people who actually understood greatness. During the intermission, Victor retreated backstage for water and a brief rest. The lobby buzzed with conversation as guests mingled, discussing the performance. The boy stayed in his seat, not wanting to lose his spot, not wanting to draw attention to himself among all these well-dressed people. But he was thirsty and decided to quickly find a water fountain. He slipped out of his row and headed toward the side corridor, keeping his head down. That's when he saw it, a door marked "Artists Only" that had been left slightly ajar. The boy knew he shouldn't, but something pulled him forward. Maybe if he could just get a glimpse of Victor up close, just see where he prepared before performing. He pushed the door open a little wider and slipped through. The backstage area was less glamorous than he'd imagined, just corridors with plain walls and fluorescent lighting. He could hear voices coming from somewhere ahead and followed them, his heart pounding. He turned a corner and froze. There, just 20 feet away, stood Viktor Petrov himself, talking to a group of well-dressed people. The boy recognized the mayor from television and several others who looked important. For a moment, the boy just stared. Here was his hero, the musician whose recordings had kept him company through so many lonely nights. Without thinking, driven by pure admiration and excitement, the boy stepped forward. "Mr. Petrov." His voice came out smaller than he'd intended. Everyone turned to look at him. The boy suddenly became very aware of his worn clothes, his messy hair, the way he didn't belong in this space. Victor's eyes narrowed immediately. He recognized the boy from Lisa's description. "How did you get back here? This area is restricted." "I'm sorry, sir, the door was open and I just wanted to say." The boy's voice trembled with nervousness and excitement. "Your music means everything to me. I've listened to your recordings so many times. You're the reason I started playing violin. You showed me that music could be—" "Security!" Victor called out sharply, cutting the boy off. A guard appeared almost immediately. "Please escort this young man back to his seat, Or better yet, see him out of the building. He clearly doesn't understand boundaries. The boy's face fell. But I just wanted to tell you, I don't have time for this, Victor said coldly. Then, noticing the violin case the boy was clutching, his expression became even more dismissive. Let me guess. You play a little violin and think that makes us colleagues? That's adorable. The wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably. One woman whispered to her companion. The mayor looked away. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them back. I didn't mean to disturb you, sir. I just wanted to say thank you. Your music has helped me through really difficult times. Victor felt a flash of annoyance. Why did poor people always have sob stories? Everyone had difficulties. That didn't mean they deserved special treatment or access to spaces they didn't belong. Well, you've said your thank you. Now please leave, so I can prepare for the second half of my performance. Unlike some people, I have professional responsibilities. The security guard gently took the boy's arm. Come on, son, let's go. As the boy was led away, Victor turned back to his important guests, forcing a smile. I apologize for that interruption. These young people today, they have no sense of proper protocol. But the mayor's wife, an elegant woman in her 60s, looked at Victor with an expression he couldn't quite read. That child traveled 3 days to hear you play. That's quite remarkable dedication. Victor waved his hand dismissively. Misguided dedication, perhaps. Now, where were we? The boy was escorted back through the corridors, past the beautiful lobby, and shown to his seat. The security guard wasn't unkind about it, but the message was clear. Stay where you belong. As the lights dimmed for the second half, the boy sat very still in his seat, his violin case on his lap. The joy he'd felt earlier had evaporated, replaced by a hollow feeling in his chest. The music that came next sounded even more distant than before, beautiful but unreachable, like something that was never meant for people like him. The lights dimmed once more, and Victor returned to the stage for the second half of his performance. The encounter with the boy had irritated him, but he pushed it from his mind. He was too professional to let anything affect his playing, or at least that's what he told himself. As he settled back onto the piano bench, Victor scanned the audience briefly. Somewhere in the back, he knew that boy was sitting. Part of him hoped the security guard had removed him entirely, but another part, a part he didn't want to acknowledge, wondered if the child was still there, still watching. He began the second piece, a complex series of etudes by Chopin. His fingers moved with mechanical precision across the keys. Every note landed exactly where it should. The tempo was perfect. The dynamics were controlled and intentional. It was a textbook performance, the kind that music students would study and try to replicate. But something was off, and Victor could feel it even if he couldn't name it. In the audience, the boy sat motionless. The humiliation from earlier still burned in his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He'd come so far. 3 days on cramped buses, sleeping sitting up because he couldn't afford the sleeping compartments. He'd eaten nothing but crackers and water to save money. His grandmother would be disappointed if he came home and hadn't at least heard the full concert. As he listened, the boy's trained ear picked up on something he'd noticed in the first half. Victor's playing was technically perfect, absolutely flawless, but it felt empty somehow, like someone reading a love letter without understanding what the words meant. The notes were there, but the heart behind them wasn't. The boy thought about his own playing, how his teacher back home, an elderly woman who'd played in orchestras decades ago, always told him that technique without emotion was just noise. Music isn't about perfect notes, she'd say. It's about truth. It's about sharing something real with the people listening. Maybe that's what was missing here. Victor played like someone showing off a skill rather than sharing a feeling. Around him, the wealthy audience members seemed transfixed, though the boy noticed that several were checking their phones, their faces bathed in the soft glow of screens. Some whispered to their companions. Others simply sat with polite, appreciative expressions that didn't quite reach their eyes. They were here because it was the sophisticated thing to do, the boy realized. They were here to be seen at a Viktor Petrov concert, to say they'd been there, to post about it on social media. But were they really listening? Did they feel anything? Victor finished the Chopin etudes and moved into a piece by Debussy, something softer and more delicate. This was always a crowd favorite, the kind of music that made people feel cultured and refined. His fingers danced across the keys with practiced ease. But in his mind, Victor kept seeing the boy's face. The way his eyes had lit up with such genuine admiration before dimming with hurt and confusion. The way he'd clutched that violin case like it was precious. The way he'd said, "Your music means everything to me," with such raw honesty. Victor missed a note. Just one, barely noticeable, a tiny hesitation that most people wouldn't even catch. But he caught it and it rattled him. He never made mistakes. Never. He was Victor Petrov, one of the greatest living pianists. He forced himself to concentrate, to push away the distraction. The rest of the Debussy piece went smoothly. When he finished, the applause was warm but not as enthusiastic as the first half. Victor noticed. He always noticed. For his final piece, he'd chosen Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, a showstopper that always left audiences amazed. It was technically demanding, full of dramatic flourishes and rapid passages that looked as impressive as they sounded. Victor launched into it with renewed energy, determined to end the night on a high note. His hands flew across the keyboard. The music filled the concert hall with power and drama. This was virtuosity on display, the kind of playing that reminded everyone why Victor Petrov commanded such high fees. The boy in the back row watched intently. This piece was incredible, no doubt about it. The speed, the precision, the showmanship, it was all there. And yet something still felt missing. The boy thought about a recording he'd heard of this same piece, played by a pianist who died 50 years ago. That version had been less technically perfect, but somehow more alive, more joyful. As Victor played the final crashing chords, the audience erupted in applause. People stood immediately, clapping enthusiastically. The boy stood too, out of respect, though his feelings were complicated. Victor bowed deeply, then again, then a third time. He gestured to the orchestra conductor who'd accompanied him on some pieces. More applause. This was better. This was the response he deserved. He left the stage but returned for 2 encores, milking the applause, letting it wash over him. This was validation. This was success. These people understood greatness when they heard it. Finally, after the second encore, Victor left the stage for the last time. The house lights came up slowly. People gathered their coats and bags, chattering excitedly about the performance. The boy stayed in his seat, letting the crowd thin out. He felt confused and a little disappointed, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Mr. Chen, the venue manager, appeared in the back row. "Well, young man, what did you think?" The boy looked up, startled. "It was incredible, sir." "He's so talented. I'll never forget this." Chen studied the boy's face. "You don't sound as happy as I expected. After coming all this way, I thought you'd be overjoyed." The boy struggled to put his feelings into words. "It was amazing, really. It's just, I don't know. I guess I expected to feel something different. More connected somehow." Chen nodded slowly. "You know, I've been working in concert halls for 35 years. I've heard hundreds of performances, and I'll tell you something not many people want to admit. Perfect technique and true artistry aren't always the same thing." "What do you mean?" "I mean that sometimes the most technically perfect performance is actually the least moving one. Real music, the kind that changes you, comes from somewhere deeper than just trained fingers." The boy thought about this, then looked down at his violin case. "My teacher says music should come from the heart first and the hands second." "Your teacher sounds wise," Chen said. "Are you any good?" The boy shrugged. "I practice every day. I'm not like Mr. Petrov, though. I've never had proper lessons at a fancy school or anything. Just what my teacher shows me, and what I figure out from listening to recordings. Would you like to meet him?" Chen asked suddenly. "Victor, I'm hosting a small reception for VIP guests backstage. It wouldn't be appropriate normally, but after how he treated you earlier, I think he owes you a proper conversation at least." The boy's eyes widened. "Really, but he doesn't want to talk to me. He made that clear." "Let me worry about Victor," Chen said with a slight smile. "The question is, do you want to?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. Despite everything, despite the humiliation and the coldness, he still admired Victor's skill. And maybe, just maybe, if they could talk properly, Victor would understand that the boy wasn't trying to claim equality or demand anything. He just loved music, genuinely and completely. "Okay," the boy said quietly. "Yes, I'd like to." Chen led him through the now empty auditorium, through the same backstage corridors the boy had snuck through earlier. But this time he wasn't sneaking. This time, he had permission. They arrived at an elegant room where about 20 people mingled, holding glasses of wine and small plates of expensive-looking appetizers. Victor stood in the center, holding court, telling some story that had his listeners laughing. When he saw Chen enter with the boy, his expression darkened immediately. "Chen, what is this?" Victor asked, his voice sharp. "This young man is my guest," Chen said calmly. "I thought it would be appropriate for him to join us." The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at the boy in his worn clothes, so obviously out of place among the designer suits and glittering jewelry. Victor's jaw tightened. "This is a private reception for patrons and VIP guests, not for—" He paused, searching for a diplomatic word. "Not for general audience members." "He traveled 3 days to hear you play," Chen said, his voice steady. "I think that earns him a few minutes of your time." The mayor's wife, who'd been watching the whole exchange, stepped forward. "Oh, let the child stay, Victor. What harm can it do? Look at him, he's completely starstruck." "It would be kind." Victor looked around the room. Everyone was watching. If he threw the boy out now, in front of all these people, especially after the mayor's wife had spoken up, he'd look petty and cruel. His image was important. He couldn't afford that. "Fine," he said through a tight smile. "But please try not to touch anything. Some of the items in this room are quite valuable." The boy nodded, shrinking slightly under Victor's cold gaze. He moved to the edge of the room, still clutching his violin case, feeling every eye on him. This had been a mistake. He should never have come back here. But then something unexpected happened. The mayor's wife walked over to him, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Hello, dear. I'm Catherine. You play violin?" The boy nodded, not trusting his voice. "How long have you been playing?" 4 years, ma'am. "And you traveled 3 days just to hear tonight's performance? That's extraordinary dedication. Victor should be flattered." Across the room, Victor heard this and felt another flash of irritation. The reception continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The boy stood near the wall, trying to make himself invisible while Catherine, the mayor's wife, asked him gentle questions about his music. Several other guests had drifted over, curious about the child who'd traveled so far. Victor watched from across the room, his irritation growing with each passing minute. This was supposed to be his night, his moment to bask in the admiration of the city's elite. Instead, people kept glancing over at the boy, whispering among themselves. Some looked sympathetic, others looked intrigued, but either way the attention was divided and Victor hated it. "Tell me, dear," Catherine said warmly, "who inspired you to start playing violin?" The boy looked down at his case. "My grandfather, mostly. He passed away 2 years ago, but he always said music was the one thing that could make a hard life beautiful. He used to play old songs on a harmonica. Nothing fancy, but it made people smile." The boy's voice grew softer. "After he died, I found some money he'd saved for me. Not much, but enough to buy a second-hand violin. I taught myself at first just by listening to recordings and trying to copy what I heard." "That's remarkable," one of the other guests said, a distinguished-looking man in a gray suit. "Self-taught musicians often have a unique quality to their playing, less constrained by traditional rules." The boy smiled shyly. "I don't know about that, sir. I found a teacher eventually, Mrs. Rodriguez. She's very old now and her hands don't work so well anymore, but she was a professional violinist years ago. She teaches me for free, in exchange for me helping her with groceries and housework." Catherine's eyes glistened. "What a beautiful arrangement. And you came all this way just to hear Victor play?" "Yes, ma'am. I've listened to his recordings so many times. He's one of the greatest pianists in the world. I wanted to hear that greatness in person, to understand what it takes to be that good." The boy glanced across the room to where Victor stood. "I thought maybe if I could hear him play live, I could learn something about dedication and excellence." His words were genuine, without a trace of irony or bitterness despite how he'd been treated. That sincerity made several of the guests uncomfortable. They'd witnessed Victor's coldness earlier, and now seeing the boy's continued admiration felt almost painful. Victor had been pretending not to listen, but he'd heard every word. Something about the boy's earnestness made him angrier. Why couldn't the child see that they existed in completely different worlds? Why did he persist in this fantasy that music was some great equalizer? A guest approached Victor with a question about his upcoming European tour, but he barely heard it. His attention was fixed on the group around the boy, which had grown to 6 or 7 people now. They were treating him like he was interesting, like he mattered. It was absurd. Finally, Victor couldn't take it anymore. He set down his wine glass and walked across the room. The conversation stopped as people sensed the tension. "I couldn't help but overhear," Victor said, his voice carrying that false pleasantness that barely concealed disdain. "You say you're self-taught? How charming. Tell me, do you also perform surgery on yourself? Perhaps practice law without attending law school?" The boy looked confused. "Sir? Music is a profession, not a hobby," Victor continued, aware that everyone in the room was now watching. "It requires years of formal training, access to the finest teachers, understanding of theory and composition at the highest levels. You can't simply pick up an instrument and call yourself a musician any more than you can pick up a scalpel and call yourself a surgeon." Catherine tried to intervene. "Victor, the boy didn't claim to be a professional. He's just a student learning for the love of it." But Victor was on a roll now, all his frustration pouring out. "That's exactly the problem with music today. Everyone thinks they're entitled to it. Everyone thinks that because they can play a few notes, they understand what real artistry means. But they don't. They can't. Not without the proper background, the proper education, the proper breeding." The word breeding hung in the air like a slap. The boy's face had gone pale. "I didn't mean any disrespect, Mr. Petrov. I know I'm not on your level. I know I'm just learning. I just love music, that's all." "Love?" Victor laughed, and it was not a kind sound. "Love doesn't make you a musician. Do you know how many hours I've practiced? Do you know what I've sacrificed? I started training when I was 4 years old. 4. While other children played, I practiced. While teenagers went to parties, I performed. I've studied at the most prestigious conservatories in 3 countries. I've worked with the greatest conductors, the finest orchestras. That's what makes a real musician. Not some romantic notion of love, and certainly not whatever noise you make on that cheap violin." He gestured dismissively at the boy's violin case. Several guests gasped. Mr. Chen stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Victor, that's enough." But Victor wasn't finished. All his insecurity, all his fear of being reminded of his own humble origins, all his need to maintain the image he'd so carefully constructed, came pouring out in a torrent of cruelty. "Look at you," he said to the boy, his voice dripping with contempt. "You come here in your shabby clothes, clutching your little violin case like it's a treasure, thinking that somehow your love of music puts you in the same category as people who have devoted their entire lives to perfecting their craft. It doesn't, it never will. Music isn't for everyone. It's not some democratic process where effort and enthusiasm equal talent. It requires something you don't have and never will have, no matter how many hours you practice in whatever hovel you call home." The room had gone completely silent. Several people looked away, unable to watch. The mayor appeared ready to leave. Catherine's face showed undisguised disgust. The boy stood there, tears streaming down his face now, making no attempt to hide them. His hands trembled as he held his violin case. For a long moment he said nothing, just absorbed the verbal assault like physical blows. Then slowly he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "You're right, Mr. Petrov, I don't have your education. I don't have your training. I grew up poor, and I'll probably stay poor. I don't have access to fancy conservatories or famous teachers." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "But I have something you seem to have lost somewhere along the way." Victor's eyes narrowed. "And what's that?" "I remember why music matters," the boy said simply. "Not because it makes me important or because it impresses rich people. Not because it gives me a fancy title or gets me into exclusive parties. I love music because it's beautiful, because it connects people. Because when my grandfather died and I felt completely alone, a simple melody gave me hope. That's what music is supposed to do. It's supposed to make people feel things." He looked around the room at all the wealthy, cultured people watching this exchange. "Your playing tonight was technically perfect. Every note exactly where it should be. But I didn't feel anything, and I don't think anyone else really did either. We clapped because we were supposed to, because it's what you do at a fancy concert. But did any of us feel moved? Did any of us feel changed?" The silence that followed was deafening, because the truth was the boy was right. Everyone in that room had attended dozens of concerts just like this one. Technically perfect performances that blurred together in memory. Events to attend, to be seen at but not to be transformed by. Victor's face had gone from red to white. "How dare you criticize my playing? You who can barely hold an instrument properly. I'm not criticizing, the boy said. I'm just asking a question. If music is only for people with money and education, if it's only for the elite, then what's the point? Doesn't that make it less valuable, not more? My grandfather could barely read, but when he played his harmonica, people cried. Not because the notes were perfect, because he meant them. That's not art, Victor said coldly. That's sentimentality. Maybe, the boy acknowledged. But which one actually matters to people? Which one actually changes lives? Victor opened his mouth to respond, but Catherine beat him to it. The boy has a point, Victor, she said quietly. I've attended your concerts for 5 years now. Every performance technically flawless, and I don't remember a single one of them. They all blur together. Perfect, polished, and utterly forgettable. Others nodded, and Victor saw his carefully constructed world starting to crack. These were his patrons, his admirers, the people who paid enormous sums to hear him play. And they were agreeing with a poor child who'd snuck into his concert. You all are being ridiculous, Victor said. But his voice had lost some of its confidence. You're letting emotion cloud your judgment. This boy is nobody. He understands nothing about real music. The boy wiped his eyes again. You're right. I understand nothing. But I'll tell you what I do know, Mr. Petrov. My teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, she played in symphonies all over the world when she was younger. She's heard the greatest musicians who ever lived. And you know what she tells me? She says the saddest thing in music is when someone has all the technique in the world, but forgets why they started playing in the first place. She says that happens to a lot of musicians when they get successful. They start playing for applause instead of for the music itself. He looked directly at Victor. Is that what happened to you? The boy walked through the backstage corridor. His vision blurred by tears he was trying hard not to let fall again. His hands shook as he clutched his violin case. He'd been humiliated, insulted, and dismissed by his hero. Every word Victor had said echoed in his mind like a curse. Maybe Victor was right. Maybe he was foolish to think he could understand real music. Maybe love wasn't enough. Maybe the world of classical music really was reserved for people with money and proper education, and he'd been stupid to dream otherwise. He found his way to the stage door exit, which led to an alley behind the concert hall. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but he welcomed it. At least out here alone, no one could see him cry. The boy sat down on the steps, setting his violin case beside him. He'd spent 6 months saving for a ticket he'd never even got to use. He'd traveled 3 days on uncomfortable buses, eating nothing but crackers and water. He'd been so excited, so full of hope. And for what? To be told he didn't belong, that his dreams were foolish, that his love of music meant nothing without the right pedigree. For several long minutes he just sat there, letting the disappointment wash over him. Then slowly something shifted inside him. Anger began to replace the hurt. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger, but something colder and more determined. Who was Victor Petrov to tell him he couldn't understand music? Who was anyone to say that beauty and art were only for the wealthy? His grandfather had been poor his entire life, worked in factories and construction sites, and yet he'd understood beauty more than most rich people ever would. Mrs. Rodriguez lived in a tiny apartment with peeling paint, but she taught him more about real musicianship than any fancy conservatory probably could. The boy opened his violin case. Inside lay the instrument his grandfather had built for him before he died. It wasn't a fancy violin from a prestigious maker. There was no elegant label inside attesting to its value. It was made from scraps of wood that his grandfather had collected over 2 years. Pieces he'd found at construction sites and wood shops, each one carefully selected, shaped, and fitted together with love and patience. The violin wasn't perfect. One of the corners wasn't quite symmetrical. The varnish was uneven in places, but when the boy played it, it sang. It had a voice that was uniquely its own, warm and slightly rough around the edges, like his grandfather's voice had been. He ran his fingers along the wood, feeling the places where his grandfather's hands had worked. Each imperfection told a story. The slight unevenness near the bridge was from where his grandfather's arthritis had made it hard to hold his tools steady. The darker patch on the back was from where he'd spilled coffee while working late one night, then spent hours trying to match the stain so it would look intentional. His grandfather had died before seeing him play this violin. He'd finished it a week before his heart attack, had handed it to the boy with tears in his eyes and said, "I'm not a master violin maker, but I made this with every bit of love in my heart. Promise me you'll play it. Promise me you'll make beauty in this world." The boy had made that promise. And tonight, sitting in this dirty alley behind a concert hall where he'd just been told he didn't belong, he remembered why that promise mattered. Viktor Petrov could say whatever he wanted about breeding and education and proper training. But Viktor Petrov had forgotten something crucial. Music wasn't about being better than other people. It wasn't about exclusive clubs or impressive credentials. It was about creating something beautiful and sharing it with the world. The boy stood up, wiping the last tears from his face. His hands had stopped shaking. He pulled the violin from its case, feeling its familiar weight. He tucked it under his chin, the wood warm against his skin, and picked up the bow. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing in the cold night air. Then he began to play. He didn't play anything famous or complicated. He played something he'd composed himself over the past year, a melody that had come to him in pieces during his long bus ride here. It was simple in structure, but it told a story, his story. It started with the loneliness he'd felt after his grandfather died, those dark months when the world seemed cold and empty. Then it shifted into the moment he'd first held this violin, the way hope had flickered back to life. It moved through the journey of learning, the frustration and small victories, the patient guidance of Mrs. Rodriguez, the joy of finally making sounds that resembled music. The melody wasn't technically complex. There were no flashy runs or impressive double stops, but it was honest. Every note came from somewhere real, somewhere true. The boy played with his eyes closed, lost in the music. He forgot about the concert hall, forgot about Viktor Petrov, forgot about being poor and unwanted. He just played, pouring his heart into every phrase. He didn't hear the stage door open behind him. He didn't notice Catherine, the mayor's wife, step out into the alley, followed by Mr. Chen and several other guests from the reception. They'd heard the music through the door and, curious, had come to investigate. They stood there in the cold, these wealthy, cultured people in their expensive clothes, and listened to a poor boy play a simple melody on a violin made from scraps. When the boy finished, letting the last note fade into the night air, there was a moment of pure silence. Then Catherine began to clap. The others joined her, their applause echoing off the alley walls. The boy's eyes snapped open. He spun around, startled, and almost dropped his violin. There were at least 10 people standing there watching him. "I'm sorry," he stammered, embarrassed. "I didn't mean to disturb anyone. I needed to play." "Don't apologize," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. "That was the most beautiful thing I've heard all night." "What was it called?" The boy looked down at his violin, suddenly shy again. "It doesn't have a name. I just made it up. It's about my grandfather." Mr. Chen stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Did you compose that yourself?" The boy nodded. "Is that wrong? I know it's not proper music or anything. Mrs. Rodriguez says I should focus on learning classical pieces before I try to write my own. But sometimes melodies just come to me and I have to get them out." "Not wrong at all," Chen said quietly. "Do you know what I heard in that music? Something that's been missing from this concert hall for a very long time. I heard truth. I heard a story that mattered." One of the other guests, a woman in a green dress who taught at the local university, spoke up. "That violin, may I ask where you got it? It has a very unusual sound. Quite lovely, actually." The boy's face lit up despite his earlier sadness. "My grandfather made it for me. He wasn't a professional or anything, just a worker who loved making things with his hands. He spent 2 years collecting pieces of wood and teaching himself how to shape them." The boy ran his hand lovingly along the violin's surface. "It's not perfect. You can see where things don't quite match up, but he made it for me. Put his heart into every piece." The woman in green came closer, examining the instrument with obvious interest. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to hold it. The boy carefully handed it over. She turned it in her hands, looking at the craftsmanship with an expert's eye. "This is extraordinary," she said, "not in spite of its imperfections, but because of them. You can see the love in every joint, every curve. I've seen $500,000 violins that have less soul than this." She handed it back carefully. "Your grandfather must have been a remarkable man." "He was," the boy said softly. "He always said that rich people could buy expensive things, but they couldn't buy the satisfaction of making something with your own hands. He said that was a kind of wealth they'd never understand." Catherine smiled. "He sounds very wise. Tell me, what's your name, dear?" "Danny," the boy said. "Danny Torres." "Well, Danny Torres, I want to ask you something," Catherine said. "Would you play that piece again? But this time, could you play it inside? I think some people need to hear it." Danny's eyes widened. "Inside the concert hall?" But Mr. Petrov said, "I don't care what Victor said," Catherine interrupted gently but firmly. "I'm on the board of directors for this venue, and right now I'm saying that this concert hall needs to remember what it was built for. Not just technical perfection, not just impressive credentials, but real music, the kind that actually moves people." Danny looked uncertain. "I don't want to cause trouble. Tonight has been difficult enough already." "You won't be causing trouble," Mr. Chen assured him. "You'll be providing clarity. Trust me, there's someone inside who needs to hear what you just played, whether he knows it or not." The other guests nodded in agreement. One man who'd been silent until now spoke up. "I've been a patron of the arts for 30 years. I've donated millions to concert halls and orchestras, and I can honestly say I've never been as moved by music as I was just now, listening to you play in this alley. Please, come inside. Share this gift properly." Danny looked down at his violin, at the instrument his grandfather had built with so much love. What would his grandfather say right now? Would he tell Danny to run away, to avoid more potential humiliation, or would he tell him to be brave, to stand up for what he believed in? The boy thought he knew the answer. "Okay," Danny said quietly. "I'll play, but I'm not doing it to show off or to prove anything. I'm doing it because this is what my grandfather would want." The reception room had grown quiet and uncomfortable after Danny left. The remaining guests stood in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones. Victor tried to continue conversing normally, but he could feel the change in atmosphere. People weren't looking at him with the same admiration as before. Some seemed disappointed. Others appeared thoughtful, as if reconsidering something they'd long taken for granted. The mayor had already left, citing an early meeting the next morning. Several other important guests had followed shortly after, offering polite but cool goodbyes. Victor felt the evening slipping away from him, his triumph turning somehow hollow. Lisa, his assistant, approached carefully. "Mr. Petrov, perhaps we should consider wrapping up for the evening. It's getting late, and we'll wrap up when I say we wrap up," Victor snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. He was losing control of the situation, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. That's when the door opened and Catherine walked back in, followed by Mr. Chen and several other guests. And there in the middle of them was the boy he'd just humiliated and sent away. The boy who should have been gone, should have been out of his life forever. Victor's jaw tightened. "What is this? I thought I made myself clear." "Victor, please be quiet for a moment," Catherine said, her voice carrying an authority that made him stop mid-sentence. "Danny has agreed to play something for us, something he composed himself, and we're all going to listen." "This is completely inappropriate," Victor protested, looking around for support. But the remaining guests were already moving closer, forming a small audience around the boy. "This is a private reception for patrons, and I'm your biggest patron, Victor," Catherine reminded him coolly. "My family has donated over $2 million to this concert hall over the years. So when I say we're going to listen to this young man play, that's exactly what we're going to do." The room fell silent. Victor felt trapped, cornered. He could refuse, could make a scene, but that would only make things worse. He was already on shaky ground after his earlier outburst. Reluctantly, he crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, his expression making clear what he thought of this whole situation. Danny stood in the center of the room, feeling more nervous than he'd ever felt in his life. All these wealthy, important people were looking at him, and Victor Petrov, the man who'd just torn him apart with words, stood there radiating disapproval. His hands trembled as he lifted his violin to his shoulder. For a moment he thought he might be sick, but then he remembered his grandfather's words. "The music doesn't care if you're scared. It just wants to be heard." Danny closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes were soft, almost fragile, like the tentative steps of someone learning to walk after a long illness. This was the grief section, the part about losing his grandfather. The melody wavered and dipped, capturing that feeling of a world that had suddenly become uncertain and cold. Victor watched with his arms still crossed, determined to remain unimpressed. It was just a simple melody, nothing technically challenging. Any first-year student could play notes like these. But even as he thought this, he found himself listening more carefully than he intended. The music began to shift. The sad melody transformed into something hopeful, hesitant at first, like dawn breaking after a long night. Danny's fingers moved across the strings with increasing confidence. He wasn't showing off, wasn't trying to impress anyone with speed or complexity. He was just telling a story the only way he knew how. This was the moment Danny had first held the violin his grandfather made. The moment hope had returned to his life. The note spoke of discovery and possibility, of finding beauty in unexpected places. The melody was simple, but it carried weight, carried meaning. Around the room, people had stopped whispering. They were genuinely listening now, drawn in by something they couldn't quite name. It wasn't technical brilliance. It wasn't virtuoso playing. It was something else entirely, something more fundamental. The woman in green who taught at the university felt tears prickling her eyes. She'd attended hundreds of concerts in her life, had analyzed countless performances. But when was the last time music had actually made her feel something real? Mr. Chen watched the boy play and thought about why he'd gotten into this business in the first place. 50 years ago, he'd been a young man who'd fallen in love with music, with the way it could communicate things words never could. When had that love become just a job? When had the magic faded into routine? Danny's melody moved into a section about learning, about the frustrating but rewarding process of coaxing beauty from an instrument. There were little stumbles in the composition, small imperfections, but they felt intentional, like they were part of the story. The music spoke of patience and persistence, of small victories and setbacks. Victor found himself unable to look away. Against his will, against everything he wanted to believe, the music was affecting him. It was pulling at something deep inside, something he'd buried years ago beneath layers of ambition and pride. He remembered being 8 years old in a village so small, it didn't appear on most maps. He remembered the first time he'd touched a piano, in the community center where his mother cleaned floors. The instrument was old and out of tune, but to his young ears, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. He remembered staying after school to practice, his mother waiting patiently in the corner, tired from work but smiling because her son had found something he loved. He remembered playing simple melodies, not perfect, not impressive, just honest expressions of how he felt. Back then, music hadn't been about impressing anyone. It had been about joy, pure, uncomplicated joy. Danny's composition built to a crescendo, not a showy one, but an emotional peak that spoke of triumph over hardship, of finding your voice despite the world telling you to stay quiet. The notes rang out clear and true, filling the elegant room with something it had been missing: authenticity. As the music swelled, several people in the room found themselves holding their breath. This was what they'd been searching for in concert halls all these years. Not perfection, not technical mastery that you could admire from a distance, but real connection. Music that grabbed your heart and refused to let go. Victor felt his chest tighten. Memories were flooding back now, unbidden and unwelcome. His first teacher, an elderly man named Mr. Petrov, for whom he'd later taken his stage name. The old man had lived in a tiny apartment filled with books and old recordings. He'd taught Victor for free because he saw something special in the boy. Remember, Vitya, the old man had said, using the diminutive form of Victor's name. Technique is the language, but emotion is what you're trying to say. Never forget what you want to say. When had Victor forgotten? When had the language become more important than the message? Danny's melody began to wind down, coming full circle to echo the opening theme, but transformed now. The grief was still there, but it had become something else, bittersweet and accepting. It spoke of carrying love with you even after loss. It spoke of honoring those who came before by continuing to create, continuing to hope. The final note hung in the air for a long moment after Danny's bow left the strings. The boy opened his eyes slowly as if waking from a dream. He looked around the room, uncertain, vulnerable. For several seconds, no one moved. The silence was complete and profound. Then Catherine began to clap, her eyes wet with tears. The others joined immediately, but this wasn't the polite, appreciative applause that had followed Victor's performance. This was different. This was genuine, moved, grateful applause. That was extraordinary, the woman in green said, her voice shaking. Truly extraordinary. I felt every moment of it, another guest added. Every single moment. Danny looked overwhelmed, almost frightened by the response. Really, it wasn't too simple? I know it's not complicated or anything. It was perfect, Mr. Chen said firmly. It was exactly what it needed to be. Honest, heartfelt, real. Across the room, Victor stood frozen. His arms had uncrossed at some point during the performance, and now they hung at his sides. His face had gone pale, his expression stunned, because he'd just realized something terrible and true. This boy, this poor, uneducated child with no formal training and a violin made from scraps, had just played something more meaningful than anything Victor had performed in years. Maybe decades. The technical perfection that Victor had spent his entire life pursuing suddenly seemed empty, hollow, like a beautiful shell with nothing inside. All the prestigious schools, all the famous teachers, all the acclaimed performances, what had they really given him? The ability to play notes perfectly, the skill to impress other musicians. But when was the last time he'd actually moved someone? When was the last time his music had made someone feel the way Danny's simple melody had just made this room feel? Catherine walked over to Danny and took his hands in hers. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for reminding us what music is really about." Danny looked confused. "I didn't do anything special. I just played from my heart like Mrs. Rodriguez taught me." "Exactly," Catherine said. "That's exactly what you did. And that's what makes it special." She turned to look at Victor, who still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. "Victor, I think you owe this young man an apology. A real one." Victor stood there, the applause for Danny still echoing in his ears. The room seemed to spin slightly, as if the ground beneath him had become unstable. Everything he'd believed about himself, about music, about what made someone worthy, was being challenged by a poor boy with a handmade violin. He looked at Danny, really looked at him for the first time. Not as an annoyance or an intruder, but as a human being. The boy was thin, probably didn't get enough to eat. His clothes were worn but clean, carefully maintained despite their age. His shoes had been repaired multiple times. But his eyes, those eyes shone with something Victor had lost somewhere along his climb to fame. Pure, uncomplicated love for music. Catherine's words hung in the air. "Victor, I think you owe this young man an apology." Victor's mouth felt dry. Apologizing meant admitting he'd been wrong. Not just about tonight, but about everything. About the walls he'd built around himself. About the contempt he'd developed for anyone he deemed beneath him. About forgetting where he'd come from. Victor started, then stopped. His voice came out rough, uncertain. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I need to tell you all something." The room waited, silent and attentive. "My real name isn't Victor Petrov," he said quietly. "It's Victor Petrovsky. I changed it to sound more distinguished, more European. I thought it would help my career." He laughed bitterly. "Everything about the person you all know is carefully constructed. The elegant clothes, the perfect manners, the refined tastes. It's all designed to make you forget who I really am." Lisa, his assistant, looked shocked. She'd worked for him for 2 years and never known this. "I grew up in a village that most people have never heard of," Victor continued, his voice growing stronger as painful memories surfaced. "My mother cleaned houses. My father left when I was 3. We lived in a 2-room apartment that was cold in winter and hot in summer. I wore second-hand clothes and often went to school hungry." He looked directly at Danny now. "I was you. Almost exactly you. A poor kid who loved music more than anything in the world." Danny's eyes widened with surprise. "There was an old piano in the community center," Victor went on. "Broken, out of tune, missing keys. But to me it was a miracle. I taught myself to play on that terrible instrument, just like you taught yourself violin. And when I played, I felt—" He paused, searching for words. "I felt like I could touch something beautiful, like for a few moments poverty and hunger and all the hardships didn't matter." Catherine watched Victor closely. This was a side of him she'd never seen, vulnerable and honest. "An old teacher took me on as a student when I was 9, Victor said. Mr. Konstantin Petrov. He was retired, had been a concert pianist in his youth. He saw something in me and offered to teach me for free. Everything I know, everything I became, started with his kindness." Victor's voice cracked slightly. "He used to tell me that technique without soul was just noise. That the greatest musicians weren't the ones who played the most notes correctly, but the ones who could make you feel something real." He laughed sadly. "I remember those lessons so clearly. He'd make me play simple pieces over and over, not to get the notes right, but to understand what the music was trying to say." He walked slowly toward Danny, each step feeling like it covered miles. "Mr. Constantine died when I was 17. By then, I'd won a scholarship to a prestigious conservatory. I was on my way to becoming what everyone calls successful. Victor stopped a few feet from Danny. But somewhere along that journey, I forgot everything he taught me. I forgot that music isn't about being better than other people. It's about being true to something bigger than yourself. The room remained completely quiet, everyone absorbed in Victor's confession. I got so caught up in competing, in being the best, in proving I deserved to be in rooms with wealthy, educated people, Victor continued. I built walls around myself. I pretended I'd always been sophisticated, always been refined. I looked down on anyone who reminded me of where I came from, because looking at them meant looking at parts of myself I wanted to forget. He met Danny's eyes directly now. When you showed up tonight, you terrified me. Not because you were disrespectful or inappropriate, but because you reminded me of who I used to be. That boy who played on a broken piano just for the love of it. The boy who believed music could save him. The boy who played from his heart instead of his ego. Tears were running down Victor's face now, and he made no attempt to hide them. I was cruel to you because I was cruel to that part of myself, he said. I mocked you because I've been mocking my own origins for so long that I forgot they were something to be proud of. You said I'd lost something along the way, and you were absolutely right. I lost the most important thing. I lost the reason I started playing in the first place. Danny stood there holding his violin, not knowing what to say. He'd expected many things tonight, but not this, not raw honesty from the man who'd humiliated him. When you played just now, Victor continued, I heard what music is supposed to sound like. I heard honesty. I heard someone sharing a piece of their soul, not showing off their technical skills, and I realized that I haven't played like that in years, maybe decades. He took a deep breath. Every performance I give is technically perfect. Critics praise my precision. Other musicians study my recordings. But you know what? I don't move people anymore. Not really. They clap because they're supposed to. They say nice things because I'm famous, but I don't touch their hearts. I don't change their lives. I'm just an expensive entertainment, like a circus act that does impressive tricks. Catherine wiped her own eyes. Around the room, others were similarly affected by Victor's raw vulnerability. You asked me earlier if music is only for people with money and education. What's the point? Victor said to Danny. At the time, I dismissed your question, but it's haunted me ever since. Because you're right. If music is just for the elite, just for people with the right credentials, then it becomes empty. It loses its purpose. He knelt down so he was at eye level with the boy. Danny, I need to apologize to you. Not a polite, empty apology, but a real one. I was wrong. About everything. You have more right to be in this concert hall than I do, because you still understand what music is really for. You haven't forgotten. You haven't let success and pride corrupt the purity of your love for it. Danny's own eyes were wet now. Mr. Petrov, Please, Victor interrupted gently. Call me Victor. Victor Petrov is just a character I play. Victor Petrovsky is who I really am, or was, or should have stayed. He reached out and gently touched the violin Danny held. Your grandfather made this? Danny nodded. He wasn't a professional, just a man who worked with his hands and loved making things. It's beautiful, Victor said, and he meant it, not in spite of its imperfections, but because of them. Because every mark on it tells a story. Because it was made with love instead of for profit. He looked up at Danny. You know what the violin I played at my debut performance is sitting in now? A climate-controlled case in a vault, worth $500,000, insured for even more, and I haven't touched it in 3 years because I'm afraid of damaging its value. The absurdity of that hit him suddenly. He'd stopped playing an instrument because he was worried about its financial worth. When had that happened? Your violin has more soul in it than any of my expensive instruments, Victor said quietly. Because it was built for love, not for status. He stood up slowly, feeling like he was carrying a great weight. Danny, I can't undo the cruel things I said to you tonight. Words have power, and once spoken, they can't be taken back. But I want you to know that you've taught me something invaluable. You've reminded me of a truth I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten it existed. What truth? Danny asked softly. That music doesn't belong to conservatories or concert halls or famous performers, Victor said. It belongs to anyone who feels it deeply enough to share it. Your grandfather understood that. Your teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, understands it. And you understand it. I'm the one who forgot. He turned to address the whole room now. I've spent 20 years building a reputation as one of the world's greatest pianists. I've performed in the most prestigious venues. I've played for presidents and royalty. I've won every award that matters in classical music. And tonight, a 12-year-old boy with a homemade violin showed me that I've wasted those 20 years. Victor, Lisa started, but he shook his head. Not wasted in terms of skill, he clarified. I can play incredibly difficult pieces. My technique is flawless, but I've wasted them because I stopped putting my heart into the music. I stopped asking myself why I was playing and started focusing only on how well I could play. I became a machine that produces perfect performances, but machines don't create art. People do. He looked back at Danny. You asked me if I'd forgotten why I started playing. The answer is yes. I had forgotten. Completely. But you've reminded me, and for that I'm more grateful than you can possibly know. Danny shifted uncomfortably, overwhelmed by the intensity of Victor's emotion. I didn't mean to make you feel bad. I was just upset and said things without thinking. No, Victor said firmly. You said exactly what needed to be said. Sometimes the truth hurts, but that doesn't make it less necessary. He paused, then asked hesitantly, Would you forgive me for the cruel things I said? 3 months had passed since that remarkable night at the Steinhardt Concert Hall. 3 months that had transformed both Victor and Danny in ways neither could have predicted. The morning after their first meeting, Victor had driven Danny to a small music shop he knew, one that specialized in quality instruments for students. The owner, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Fisher, had been repairing and selling instruments for over 40 years. I want you to have a proper violin, Victor had said. Not to replace your grandfather's, that one is precious and should be kept safe. But you need an instrument you can practice on without worrying about damaging something irreplaceable. Danny had protested, embarrassed by the expense, but Victor had insisted. Let me do this, please. I have more money than I know what to do with, and this would actually mean something. They'd spent 2 hours trying different violins until they found one that sang in Danny's hands. A 100-year-old instrument with a warm, rich tone. Not expensive by professional standards, but far beyond anything Danny could have afforded. But the violin was just the beginning. Victor had rearranged his entire schedule to make room for teaching Danny. 3 times a week, the boy would take a bus to Victor's home, a beautiful house on the edge of the city, and they would work together in Victor's private music room. The sessions were unlike any teaching Victor had done before. Yes, he taught Danny proper technique, how to hold the bow correctly, how to position his fingers for optimal sound, how to read complex sheet music. But more importantly, he learned from Danny. Why did you play that passage that way? Victor would ask after Danny finished a piece. Because it felt sad but also kind of hopeful, Danny would explain. Like when you're missing someone but also grateful you knew them. And Victor would nod and think about how he'd been playing that same piece for 20 years without ever considering what it was trying to say, only how difficult it was to execute. Sometimes Mrs. Rodriguez, Danny's elderly teacher, would join them. Victor had insisted on meeting her after hearing so much about her wisdom. She'd arrived at his house in a taxi. A tiny woman in her 70s with hands gnarled by arthritis but eyes bright with intelligence. So you're the famous Victor Petrov, she'd said, looking him up and down. The one who made my student cry. Victor had winced. Yes, ma'am. That's me. And I'm deeply ashamed of it. She'd studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Good. Shame can be a teacher if we let it. Danny tells me you've changed, that you're trying to find your way back to real music. I'm trying, Victor had admitted. He's helping me more than he knows. Mrs. Rodriguez had smiled then. He has a gift for that. Not just for music, but for reminding people what matters. She'd looked around Victor's expensive home, at all the awards and photographs on the walls. You've accomplished impressive things, Mr. Petrov. But accomplishments aren't the same as meaning. I think you're beginning to understand that. Over the following weeks, Victor had started changing his approach to his own music. He'd canceled 2 concerts that were purely about prestige and big paychecks. Instead, he'd started performing at smaller venues, community centers, even a performance at a youth center in a poor neighborhood where Danny lived. That performance had been terrifying in a way that sold-out concert halls never were. The audience was full of kids like Danny, children who had nothing but loved music anyway. They didn't care about his reputation or his perfect technique. They just wanted to feel something. Victor had played Chopin that night, but not the showy pieces he usually performed. He'd played a simple nocturne, one of the first pieces he'd ever learned as a child. And he'd played it the way he used to play, with all the vulnerability and honesty of someone who was sharing something precious. When he finished, a little girl in the front row, maybe 6 years old, had tears running down her face. "That was so beautiful," she'd whispered, and Victor had knelt down beside her and said, "Thank you. That means more to me than you know." He'd driven home that night thinking about how he'd performed for presidents who had politely applauded while checking their phones. And here this child with worn-out shoes had been moved to tears. Which performance mattered more? Meanwhile, Danny had been growing as a musician in remarkable ways. The technical training Victor provided had elevated his playing without diminishing his emotional honesty. He was learning to read complex scores, to understand music theory, to execute difficult passages with precision, but he never lost sight of why he was playing. "Technique is just the tools," Danny had said during one lesson. "Like how my grandfather had hammers and saws and other tools to build my violin. But the tools aren't what mattered. What mattered was what he wanted to create and why." Victor had written that down in a notebook he'd started keeping, full of observations and insights from his young student. Sometimes he'd flip through it late at night, amazed at how much wisdom could come from a 12-year-old boy who'd grown up with nothing. Catherine, the mayor's wife, had been true to her word about arranging a concert, but she'd worked with Victor and Danny to make it something special. Not just a showcase of talent, but a statement about what music could be. They'd decided to hold it at the Steinhardt Concert Hall, the same venue where their story had begun. But this time, half the tickets would be free, distributed to schools in low-income neighborhoods, to community centers, to anyone who loved music but couldn't afford expensive tickets. Music shouldn't be just for rich people, Victor had announced at a press conference, stunning the reporters who'd expected him to talk about his own brilliance. It should be for everyone. And this concert is going to prove that. The program they'd designed was carefully thought out. Victor would perform technically demanding pieces that demonstrated the heights of classical achievement. Danny would perform simpler pieces that showcased emotional depth and authenticity, and together, they would play several duets that combined Victor's technical mastery with Danny's heartfelt expression. Now, the night of the concert had finally arrived. Backstage, Danny stood in front of a mirror, wearing a suit that had been tailored especially for him. He looked older than his 12 years, but his eyes still held that same wonder and nervousness. Victor stood beside him, adjusting his own tie. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," Danny admitted. "What if I mess up? What if people realize I don't really belong on the same stage as you?" Victor turned to look at him. "Danny, you belong on that stage more than most professional musicians I know. You belong there because you have something real to share. And yes, you might make mistakes. So what? Mistakes are human. Perfection is boring." "That's not what you would have said 3 months ago," Danny pointed out with a slight smile. "No," Victor agreed. 3 months ago I was an idiot. Today I'm slightly less of an idiot thanks to you." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at the doorway, looking elegant in a simple black dress. The concert organizers had given her a seat of honor in the front row. "My boys," she said warmly. "Look at you both. So handsome, so ready." Danny rushed over to hug her. "I'm so scared, Mrs. Rodriguez." "Good," she said, patting his back. "Fear means you care. It means this matters to you. Just remember what I've always told you, play the truth. Everything else will follow." She turned to Victor. "And you, Mr. Famous Pianist, you remember what you've learned?" Victor nodded seriously. "That music is a conversation, not a lecture. That touching one person's heart matters more than impressing 1,000 people's minds. That where I came from isn't something to hide but something to honor." "Good man," Mrs. Rodriguez said with approval. "Now go out there and show them what real music sounds like." As she left, Victor and Danny looked at each other. "Together?" Danny asked. "Together," Victor confirmed. They walked toward the stage entrance where Mr. Chen was waiting to give them their cue. Through the curtain they could hear the audience settling in. It was completely full. A mix of wealthy patrons in expensive clothes and families from poor neighborhoods in their best outfits, sitting side by side. "This is unprecedented," Chen whispered, his eyes shining with excitement. "We've never had an audience this diverse. This is what this concert hall was always meant to be." The lights dimmed. The audience grew quiet. Victor felt his heart racing, but it wasn't the usual pre-performance anxiety about being perfect. It was excitement about sharing something real, about being honest. about honoring the journey that had brought him to this moment. Mr. Petrov, Mr. Torres, Chen said formally, even though they'd become friends over the past months. You're on. They walked onto the stage together. The audience erupted in applause. Victor noticed that the people from poor neighborhoods were clapping just as enthusiastically as the wealthy patrons. Maybe more so, because to them Danny represented possibility. He represented the idea that talent and passion mattered more than money or status. Victor sat at the piano. Danny stood beside him with his violin. They decided to open with a duet, a piece they'd arranged together specifically for this concert. It was based on the melody Danny had played in the alley that first night. But Victor had created a piano accompaniment that elevated and supported it without overwhelming it. They began together, Victor's piano providing a gentle foundation while Danny's violin sang the melody. It was simple but beautiful, honest but skilled.